They say the galaxy forgets nothing, that every scream, every sin, every oath whispered beneath the Emperor's gaze leaves an echo, faint but eternal, drifting through the warp like ash upon a storm. I used to believe that was just superstition, the lies soldiers tell themselves so they can keep dying with purpose. But I know better now. I have walked through the ruins of my own faith. I have heard the Emperor's name twisted into mockery and prayer in the same breath, and I have seen what becomes of those who love him too much, and those who dared love him too little. I was a son of the Great Crusade. I bore his sigil on my armor, his words carved into my bones. I watched the stars burn for his dream. Then I turned my blade against him. I told myself I had reasons. Truth, justice, loyalty to a different ideal. But reasons are fragile things in eternity. Now as my gene seed rots and my warplate rusts with memory, I understand that betrayal has no ideology. It is only hunger, the hunger to be seen by the God who forgot you. This is my confession, offered not to absolve but to remember. For memory is all that remains when faith and flesh fail. If the throne still listens, let these words be my penance. If not, then let the void carry them where even demons fear to hear. Before we begin, if the sound of truth buried under centuries of lies stirs something within you, if the echo of a lost legion still haunts your dreams, then lend this voice your attention. Subscribe, share, remember. In a galaxy that devours history, remembrance itself is rebellion. Before the fall, before the rot of gods and lies, there was only light. It poured across the golden plains of Terra like the first breath of creation, gleaming against the armor of 1,000 legions assembled in unbroken ranks. The air trembled with the hum of engines and the low, sacred thunder of war machines, and in that moment, I believed that nothing could ever die again. We were his sons, not by blood but by purpose, each of us a vessel of perfection forged in the crucible of the Emperor's dream. His light was all we had ever known, and in it our shadows did not yet exist. I remember the day of my oath. The sky was a wound of fire, streaked with the contrails of ships breaking the atmosphere, the sound of their descent like the roar of ancient beasts. We stood upon the marble causeway leading to the Imperial Palace, our armor still unpainted, each plate a mirror of the dawn. My heart was a weapon then, beating in rhythm with the drums that rolled through the ranks. The Primarch stood before us, radiant, terrifying, beautiful. His voice was not a sound but an event, shaking the marrow of those who heard it. He spoke of duty, of conquest, of unity beneath the Emperor's will. We swore to bring enlightenment to the stars, and I believed him. Emperor, forgive me, I truly did. In those days the Imperium was young and unbroken. We conquered in his name not as tyrants but as messengers. We brought order to worlds that had forgotten what light was. I can still recall the taste of dust in my mouth as our fleet made landfall on the dead plains of Gyros, the scent of promethium mixing with ozone as we purged the Xenos nests from their ruins. Each victory was a hymn, each kill a verse. We were the Emperor's hands, and the galaxy trembled beneath our touch. But even then, even in that sacred fire, the first cracks had begun to spread. Some worlds did not kneel as easily as others. Some refused the Emperor's truth. When we burned them, their screams did not sound like heresy. They sounded like grief. I remember asking my sergeant, a veteran whose name I will not dishonor by speaking, what sin could justify such ruin. He told me it was not ours to question, that faith demanded silence, not understanding. I accepted that then. I told myself obedience was its own virtue, but in the silence that followed I began to hear things, not voices, not yet, just the faintest hum beneath the Emperor's light. Like a truth trying to speak through the noise. We would kneel for the Primarch after every campaign, and he would walk among us, an immense, flawless, impossible. His presence was gravity itself. The air bent around him. When he looked at me, I felt as though he saw everything. My fear, my pride, the secret longing to be worthy of his regard. He spoke softly, but every word felt like a command written upon my bones. We do not fight for glory, he said once. We fight for perfection, for the unity of mankind. I repeated those words 1,000 times over the years, long after their meaning had curdled in my mouth. There was a night, on the eve of another crusade, when I stood in the ship's chapel before a mural of the Emperor painted in his own radiant image. The artist had rendered his face with impossible serenity, the eyes watching even in stillness. I knelt, whispered my prayers, and asked to be made pure enough to serve him without question. The lights flickered. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw him turn his head, not in blessing, but in sorrow. I convinced myself it was fatigue. But when I rose, I could no longer remember the words of the oath I had spoken years before. Only the silence remained, patient and immense. That was the beginning of the fracture. Not a rebellion, not yet, just the seed of a question buried too deep to name. We marched beneath banners of gold and white, our faith shining brighter than the stars we conquered. But something beneath that light had begun to stir. I felt it in the stillness after battle, in the way my brothers averted their eyes when our Primarch spoke too long of unity, in the dreams that haunted me when the ship drifted through the void. Dreams of the Emperor unarmored, looking at me not as a son but as a mistake. Even now, I can smell the oil that was burned to sanctify our blades, can hear the echo of the Mechanicus hymns that blessed our bolters. We believed that faith and logic had become one under his gaze. We were wrong. Faith obeys. Logic questions. And I was beginning to wonder which of those the Emperor truly desired from his sons. The day before Istvan, I would still have died for him. But that night, in the silence between prayers, I found myself asking the first heretical thought that would damn me forever. If perfection is what he demands, why did he make us human at all? We sailed from Terra beneath banners that caught the lumen strips like captive dawn, our strike cruisers slipping through the void with predatory grace, each hull warded by catechisms etched in high Gothic by robed tech priests whose vox grills rasped incense-laden hymns. In the hangar decks, the air tasted of promethium and sanctified oil, and the Skitarii detachments assigned to us marched in perfect cadence along the gantries, optics burning a steady red as if the machine spirit itself were a watchful sergeant. I remember the scrape of my gauntlets across the sigils carved into my pauldrons, the way the Imperial Aquila seemed to warm beneath my touch, as if agreeing that I still belonged to it. We were bound for another compliance, another world whose name would be erased by history and replaced with a designation on a data slate, another conquest to feed our certainty. The lectures in the Strategium were all geometry and inevitability, lines of advance drawn with the calm assurance of men who thought the stars themselves obeyed. It comforted me to stand among brothers, to feel the old, simple weight of command settle like a cloak. Orders given, orders obeyed. Nothing left unspoken except the tremor that ran through the hull whenever the Geller field flexed and something outside pressed a thought against the ship and called us by names we had not yet earned. On the fourth week, after a victory that should have tasted like triumph, I found myself alone in the armory while the artificers chanted the rites of maintenance over our warplate. The place was a forest of steel trees, racks of bolters, blades sealed in ceramite sheaths, chainswords hanging like predatory fruit. A servitor drifted past on a track, its mouth sewn shut in neat devotional stitches, and I envied its silence. In the reflection of a polished breastplate, I caught my own face, a soldier's mask carved by habit and the Primarch's example, and I watched it hold the expression I had learned to wear, calm, dutiful, empty of doubt. Behind me, the cogitators clicked like distant teeth. I realized that if I stood very still, I could hear the ship speak. Not in words, not in the Binharic of the Mechanicus, but in the steady, tired groan of a thing that had carried too much faith too far. I spoke aloud, a foolish prayer whispered to a machine, and asked it whether obedience could become a sin. The reply, if it came, was only the hiss of vents exhaling dust. The next world resisted. They always did in some small way. A planetary governor with a spine like a rod of glass stood before the picked feed and swore loyalty, in the same voice that had ordered the disappearance of his own dissidents. We landed anyway, boots burying themselves in the ash of a manufactorum that had not slept in a century, the air hot with dying motors. We did not bring the sword first. We brought the book, a remembrancer assigned to our expedition, one of those soft-voiced historians who painted the truth until it gleamed, asked to march with us into the administratum block and record the moment unity took root. I remember his hands, ink-stained and steady, as he sketched the Imperial Aquila above the governor's dais. I remember the way the governor's eyes flickered to a door behind the throne. Afterward, we opened that door and found a room full of bones, workers who had prayed for rations and received oubliette. Duty demanded we call it necessary correction. Something older in me called it a ledger balanced in blood. I signed the compliance orders with a stylus that shook only once. Back aboard, the remembrancer brought me a sketch he had made of the Primarch, lines so precise they seemed to vibrate with contained power. He asked what words we should place beneath the image when it was shown to the newly compliant. I told him to write perfection. He smiled, pleased to have the right answer, and left me alone with the portrait of a man I loved beyond reason. I traced the curve of the jaw with a finger and felt absurdly, like a child mapping the constellations on the ceiling of a chapel. Then, in the quiet, a memory rose unbidden. The Primarch's voice not on the parade ground or the Strategium Rostrum, but in a corridor after a victory speech, low and unguarded. "Perfection is a moving target," he had said to a captain whose name time has since devoured. "You must shoot while running." At the time I thought it wisdom. Now I heard it as the confession of a man already chasing something he could never catch. The orders for redeployment came sealed, with sigils so numerous they looked like armor. Istvan. The name passed through, the vox like a spark too bright to see, wrapped in honor, wrapped in secrecy. We prepared without ceremony. In the chapel I knelt, and for the first time I did not ask for victory. I asked for clarity. The candles guttered. A draft crept through the vents and made the flame bend toward the mural of the Emperor, as if even fire acknowledged hierarchy. I bowed my head and tried to remember the first time I believed. Across the deck, a brother recited the litany of true aim with a fervor that would have moved stone. I envied him like a starving man envies a full table. There are moments before every campaign when the world shrinks to simple things. The click of maglocks as you seat a magazine. The sharp, clean smell of solvent on a newly scrubbed bolt. The rasp of leather across the haft of a blade as you test a grip you already know by heart. My sergeant, his name a locked reliquary in my mind, walked the line, tapping greaves, testing seals, his voice a steady counter-melody to the ship's hum. Check, check, check. He stopped before me and studied my face as if searching for a fracture in the ceramite. "You are with me," he said, not as question, but as binding. I nodded. It was only later I understood that he had seen the hairline line of doubt and placed his hand over it like a smith welding a crack before stress can finish the break. The navigator sang us through the storm, a keening echo even through meters of steel, and the warp pressed its freezing breath against the hull. In those nights without stars, I dreamed of Terra's light as if it were a hearth I had fled, and woke tasting ash. A chaplain made his rounds, Crozius against deck, rhythm steady as a heart, and told us that the Astronomican burned not only to guide ships, but to remind the faithless they were watched. I asked if that meant the faithful were unseen. He laughed kind and told me there are questions that sound like courage when they are only weariness. We translated at last to real space, and Istvan spread beneath us like a wound that had scabbed and been torn open again. Vox traffic crackled. Orders layered like lacquer until the original wood beneath could no longer be seen. On the muster decks, legionaries clasped vambrace to vambrace, iron against iron, and spoke the names of brothers as if names could ward death. I stored 3 in my hearts and did not say them aloud for fear the ship would hear and decide to keep them. In the moments before drop, I raised my helm and looked once more at the portrait the remembrancer had finished, now pinned above my rack. The Primarch's eyes, rendered in strokes of patient ink, held something I could not name. Pride certainly, purpose always, but behind it, just at the edge of the artist's skill, a shadow like a bruise under glass. I lowered the helm. The seals engaged with a hiss that sounded like a sigh. The ramp lights clicked from red to amber and every muscle remembered its work. The world became weight and noise. I told myself there would be time after Istvan to decide what to believe. I told myself decisions could be scheduled like deployments. The ramp hammered down. Heat rushed in. Sky like a furnace, ground like a tomb. And in the instant before impact, with the vox alive in my ear and the universe reduced to the furious simplicity of descent, I heard a voice I knew too well, a command I had waited a lifetime to obey. It was not the Emperor's. The first thing I remember of Istvan is the color, not the red of blood or the black of soot, but a molten hue that lived somewhere between them, a furnace glow that seemed to pour from the planet itself, as though the ground were still screaming from what had been done to it before we arrived. The ash was so thick it muffled our boots, swallowing sound and shape alike, and the sky burned with the kind of light that should have belonged to a dying sun. Even through my armor's filters I could taste it. Metal, salt, the faint sweetness of something long decayed. It was a battlefield pretending to be a world. We descended in silence, formation perfect as ever. To outsiders, it might have looked like faith incarnate, the Emperor's angels descending to bring another heretic world into the fold. Only we knew the truth. The orders were strange, the objectives unclear, the command hierarchy fractured in ways no disciplined legion should ever tolerate. But we obeyed, because obedience was all that held us together. It was our curse and our creed. When we landed, I saw the banners of our brother legions already staked into the dust, colors I had bled beside on 100 worlds. I felt something like relief. The air shimmered with heat, and in that distorted haze I could almost believe we were still the same army that had left Terra to cleanse the stars. But the vox was too quiet, the greetings too formal. There were gaps between words where once there had been laughter, the kind of spaces that only grow when men start to wonder whether the ones they call brother still recognize them at all. The first shots came without warning, a sound like thunder cracking through bone, and then the world erupted. The ground beneath us split open as artillery fire from the ridge turned the ash into waves of molten glass. Our comms screamed, a dozen voices overlapping in chaos, but above them all I heard one. My Primarch's calm and cold, ordering us to stand fast. I obeyed without hesitation. You don't question the voice that made you what you are. But somewhere deep inside, something broke. A splinter of disbelief so small I almost didn't feel it. We had been betrayed, and still I could not make myself see who the traitors were. I remember running through smoke thick enough to hide gods, my brothers falling beside me like burning statues. I remember seeing the armor of another legion, our supposed allies, flashing through the haze, their bolters cutting down those who still called them kin. I remember shouting for them to stop, my voice drowned by gunfire. When I finally reached one of them, I tore his helm free with my gauntlet and found a face I knew. A friend from the early Crusades. His expression was serene. "You were never meant to stand with him," he said, and then he drove his blade into my chest. I survived only because the blast that followed threw us both into the crater. My armor sealed around the wound, hissing with the stink of burnt flesh. I lay there staring up at the ashen sky, and for the first time since I had sworn my oath, I felt utterly hollow. Around me the planet burned, the legions tearing each other apart like beasts unchained. The Emperor's dream, that fragile illusion of unity, died screaming on that soil. We fought for days. The details blur together now, a fever of fire and hate. There were moments when the lines between loyalist and traitor ceased to matter. The smoke erased insignia, and every silhouette became the same. It was no longer war, but attrition, a machine grinding itself down to silence. I saw chaplains reciting litanies as they bled out, apothecaries using their last shots on themselves. I saw one of our dreadnoughts, crippled and burning, crawl toward the enemy lines just to drag 3 of them into the pit with him. I do not remember when I stopped counting the dead. What I do remember is the moment the Primarch called for retreat. His voice reached us through the static, measured, almost gentle, as though nothing around us was dying. He told us this was not defeat but revelation, that the Emperor had shackled us with false divinity, that true freedom lay in rejecting his silence. Those words should have sounded like heresy. Instead, they felt like truth spoken aloud after an age of repression. In the distance, I saw him standing amidst the firestorm, his armor glowing with reflected flame, his eyes bright with conviction. And I understood why men followed him, why they would burn worlds for him. I wanted to believe that he was right, that the betrayal was justified. But the faces of my fallen brothers haunted me, and I could not tell whether their deaths were liberation or murder. When night finally fell, if it can be called night under such a sky, I stood alone among the ruins. The air shimmered with heat and grief. My armor was cracked, my weapon half melted, and my faith hanging by threads I no longer knew how to mend. The Emperor had not spoken. The Primarch had, and in that silence between them, I made the mistake of listening to both. The fires of Istvan burned for days, though in memory they lasted forever. The atmosphere itself seemed alive, trembling with the weight of unending bombardment. When I close my eyes, even now I can still hear the screams, not of men dying but of metal, of machine spirits ruptured in betrayal. Our dropships lay shattered in the valleys, their hulls split open like carcasses, their cogitators still whispering fragments of litanies for deliverance that would never come. The air was thick with vaporized blood, and the ash that settled on my armor felt almost warm, as though the planet itself pitied us. We gathered what few survivors remained. There were less than 200 of us from a company that had once numbered thousands. We moved through the ruins in silence, our vox links dead, our banners gone. Each of us wore the same expression behind our helms, the hollow calm of those who have seen their gods bleed. I remember walking past a fallen chaplain, his crosier still clutched in hand, its head dented from use as a weapon rather than a symbol. The skull icon was cracked down the middle, and inside the fracture I saw my reflection. Two halves of faith that no longer fit together. It was then that the Primarch himself came to us. His armor was scorched, his blade still wet with the black ichor of those who had opposed him, and yet he stood untouched by fatigue. His presence was unbearable, a gravity that bent thought, a heat that turned devotion into something fevered. He spoke not as a commander but as a prophet, telling us that we were free at last, that the Emperor's tyranny had been unmasked, that we were not deserters but liberators. Around me men wept. They raised their weapons in salute. They shouted oaths of loyalty renewed, and I said nothing. When he looked at me, it was as though all sound fled the world. His gaze was not anger nor mercy but expectation. I could feel him searching me, peeling back layers of duty and doubt until he reached the raw core of what I was. He smiled then, a smile that might have been love once before it curdled into something colder. "You were always faithful," he said. "Now you can prove it." That was the moment of damnation. Not the first shot fired, not the killing of brothers, but that simple blessing, that invitation to believe again, even as belief became poison. I knelt not because I understood, but because I could not bear the weight of his gaze, and when his hand rested on my helm, sealing me to his cause, I felt something break inside me with the sound of glass underfoot. In the years that followed, I told myself that what I had done at Istvan was survival, that we were victims of circumstance, caught in a web of loyalty stretched too thin to hold. But deep down I knew the truth. I had chosen. I had seen the Emperor's silence and the Primarch's certainty, and I had chosen the voice that answered. I told myself it was courage, that faith must sometimes rebel to remain pure. But it was not courage. It was fear, the fear of being forgotten by the God who had built us to be perfect, then discarded us as flawed. We left Istvan behind us, though in truth, it never left us. Our ships rose through a sky that rained fire, and when I looked down through the viewing port, I saw the surface still writhing, as though the planet itself were trying to hide its shame beneath molten stone. I thought of Terra, of the Emperor seated upon his golden throne, his light stretching across the void like judgment. Did he see what we had done? Did he care? Or had he turned his gaze away long before, content to let his children devour one another so that the dream could survive the blood that birthed it? I have heard it said, in the long centuries since, that betrayal is the only truth the galaxy never forgets. But I tell you this, betrayal is not a moment. It is a contagion. It seeps, it whispers, it waits. It does not end when the killing stops. It becomes a language spoken in silence, a rhythm that beats beneath the armor and the scars. Every world we burned afterward, every act we justified in the name of liberation, was only Istvan repeating itself in endless echo. Sometimes, when I sleep, if what I do can still be called sleep, I see that field of ash again. I see the faces of those I once called brother, frozen in their final disbelief, their armor half melted, their hands still reaching out toward me as if I could have saved them. I wake with my gauntlets clenched, the scent of promethium still in my lungs, and I wonder whether they ever forgave me. Then I remember that forgiveness requires gods, and ours were already dead, one on the throne, the other by his own ambition. And yet, somewhere beneath all the ruin, I still hear his name, not the Primarch's, the other one, the name I swore beneath Terra's sun when the world was still new. It comes faintly like static through a broken vox, and though I tell myself it is only memory, part of me answers, I should have died on Istvan. Every part of me did, except the part that still remembered how to pray. That is where the long war truly began, not in rebellion, not in vengeance, but in the silence that follows confession. There are wars that end when the blood dries and the banners fall, and there are wars that crawl onward through the marrow of those who fought them. The long war was the latter, not a campaign but a sentence. The Imperium we had betrayed never forgot, and the gods we turned to never forgave. We became wanderers in eternity, our armor rusting beneath layers of scripture and filth. our faith scoured clean by centuries of attrition. The warp became our sky, our cradle, our punishment. At first, we still fought with purpose. Every legion that fell into rebellion clung to its own mythology, its own reason for existing. Some sought vengeance, others sought meaning. My brothers, what few of us remained, convinced ourselves that our suffering was proof of righteousness. We called the warp our refuge, though it was anything but. It welcomed us as the ocean welcomes the drowned. Our fleet drifted between systems lost to the Imperium, hunting worlds too broken to matter. We scavenged, bled, and built empires from the bones of our dead. Each victory tasted of rot. Each defeat became a sacrament. We told ourselves the Emperor's light could not reach us here, that his silence was a blessing. But silence is never empty in the warp. It is full of listening things. I learned to sleep with my eyes open, to keep my thoughts sheathed behind the dull hum of battle prayers. Sometimes, when the Geller field flickered, I saw faces pressing against the void glass, their mouths open in voiceless song. The demons did not come to kill us. They came to admire us, to marvel at how far we had already fallen without their touch. We had become what they envied, mortals capable of eternal corruption. The Primarch was gone by then, vanished into his own madness or ascended to something worse. None of us spoke his name aloud, though we felt his presence like gravity. We fought in his image still, even when that image blurred into legend. Each warlord who rose among us claimed to carry his vision, each more brutal than the last. The warp reshaped them, just as it reshaped us. Flesh melding with metal, armor growing like bone, voices echoing from throats that no longer belonged to any species known to man. We had become scripture written in agony. There were moments, brief and terrible, when I remembered what it had been to be human. Once, during a raid on a forgotten colony, we found survivors. A handful of farmers living among the ruins of a world abandoned during the heresy. They fell to their knees at the sight of us, believing salvation had come at last. Their leader, an old man whose eyes were still clear, approached me and asked if the Emperor had sent us. I almost laughed. Then I saw the small Aquila carved into the dirt at his feet, 2 crude wings joined by faith rather than precision, and something inside me twisted. I told him the truth, that the Emperor had forgotten them, that the galaxy had moved on. He nodded once as if that answer had always been waiting for him and thanked me. He said he could die in peace now, knowing the lie was finally gone. I should have left them. Instead, I gave the order. Fire cleansed the settlement in seconds. My men called it mercy. I told myself the same. But afterward, I scraped what was left of the Aquila from the ashes and kept it in my gauntlet until the edges wore smooth. I still have it. It cuts me when I hold it, but I think I deserve that pain. Time became meaningless. In the warp, centuries blur together like spilled ink. I do not know how long we fought, only that every war felt like a repetition of Istvan. Betrayal rehearsed until it became ritual. We raided imperial convoys, burned shrines, slaughtered pilgrims. Sometimes we spared them, only to watch what mercy did to their faith. Every act of cruelty was meant to hurt the Emperor, to make him feel what we felt. But he never answered. His silence stretched across eternity, vast and immaculate. And in that silence, we began to hear other voices whispering promises of power, redemption, understanding. Some of my brothers embraced them. I watched their eyes change, their flesh warp into shapes that had no place in creation. They said they were becoming closer to the divine. I said nothing. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps damnation is simply the next form of devotion. Yet even as the gods called to me, I found myself praying still to the one who had forsaken me. In the dead of the ship's cycle, when even the demons slept, I would stand before the viewport and stare into the endless storm of the warp. I would whisper his name and ask for nothing. Not forgiveness, not salvation, only acknowledgement. The storm would answer with thunder, and for a heartbeat, I could almost pretend it was his voice. There was a warlord among us once, a champion of the warp who claimed he had seen the Emperor in his true form, not as a god of light, but as a machine of faith feeding on worship to sustain the corpse that ruled mankind. He said the throne was no prison but a pulpit, and that the Emperor's silence was not death but hunger. His words spread through the fleet like contagion. Some fell to their knees in adoration. Others tore out their vox grills and screamed. I listened and said nothing. I had stopped believing in truth. Belief itself had become the weapon that ruined us, and I no longer trusted it. The long war was not fought with bolters and blades. It was fought within us, every battle a choice between despair and devotion, every victory another form of loss. I survived not because I was strong, but because I refused to end. Perhaps that was my final sin, endurance without purpose. And yet even monsters grow weary of eternity. There is a kind of silence that only the warp can make. It isn't quiet, not truly, but a space between screams where even the gods seem to listen. That was the silence that followed me after the centuries blurred together and the long war devoured meaning. I had forgotten how many crusades we fought, how many worlds we burned. I only remember that every time we won, we lost something else. A name, a memory, a reason to keep fighting. The Imperium endured, as it always does, grinding forward like a machine too vast to die, and we the damned circled its edges like carrion that refused to rot. We no longer called ourselves Astartes. That word belonged to another age, a purer language. We were fragments of a promise undone, relics of a war that had outlived even its purpose. Our ships creaked with age, their hulls covered in icons both holy and profane. Once they had sung the litanies of the machine god. Now they whispered to things older than logic, voices woven from prayer and data alike. I began to realize that faith was not the Emperor's gift to mankind. It was our curse, the disease that made us build gods in our own image and then die trying to live up to them. In time, I became a leader. Not through ambition, but attrition. When enough of your brothers die, command becomes less a privilege and more an inevitability. My warband was small, a scarred remnant of those who still remembered Terra not as myth but as home. We fought beneath no banner for no god. Our symbol was a blank sigil etched into rusted plate, a mark of absence. Some called us cowards for refusing patronage. Others called us free. Both were wrong. We were ghosts with purpose, and ghosts cannot choose their hauntings. There were moments when I thought the war had ended. Fleets would vanish for decades, swallowed by the warp or the arrogance of their masters. And rumors would spread that the Imperium was dying, that the throne's light had finally guttered out. Each time the Astronomican flared anew and hope died again. We began to understand that the galaxy itself was our punishment, infinite, cyclical, a mirror reflecting our sins forever. I met demons who spoke in the voices of my fallen brothers. I watched a Chaos Lord tear his own heart from his chest to feed a god that never answered. I saw worlds where the warp and reality had merged so completely that even time was an open wound. I felt awe, horror, envy, Mary, but never faith. Faith had abandoned me on Istvan, and all that remained was the ritual of survival. It was on one such world, a nameless husk circling a dying sun, that I found what I had not realized I was searching for. The surface was glass, cracked and fused, as though some immense fire had once tried to erase it from existence. We came seeking resources. What we found instead was a structure half buried in obsidian, a cathedral, impossibly ancient, built in the same pattern as the sanctums of Terra's early crusades. Inside, the air was still, the light dim. My men moved cautiously, weapons ready, but there were no signs of life, no echoes of battle, only statues, hundreds of them, kneeling in unison before an altar that had long since turned to dust. At the center of that altar was a single object, a helm, ornate and familiar, the kind once worn by the Emperor's custodians. It was cracked through the crown, the gold dulled by centuries of neglect. I reached out to touch it, and for the first time in what felt like millennia, I felt warmth. Faint, steady, like the heartbeat of something impossibly distant, yet alive. My brothers fell to their knees without understanding why. I stood frozen, my gauntlet trembling over the relic, and a single thought entered my mind unbidden. He still sees us. I took the helm, though none of us spoke of it. From that day onward, strange things began to happen. Our ship, long half dead, began to respond to our commands with impossible precision. Our weapons no longer jammed. Our wounds healed faster. Some said it was a gift from the ruinous powers. Others whispered that it was a sign, that the Emperor himself had forgiven us. I said nothing. I only carried the helm into battle, and wherever I did, we did not lose. But victory, I have learned, is only another form of deceit. Power always demands its price. The more I wore the helm, the more I dreamed. Visions of Terra burning, of the throne's light pulsing like a dying star, of a figure seated in silence, unmoving yet aware. In those dreams I tried to speak, to beg, to confess, but the figure would only raise a single hand and I would wake screaming, the scent of ozone and sanctified oil filling the air. My brothers began to fear me. They whispered that I carried a curse. Perhaps they were right. One by one they left, some to seek glory among the gods, others to vanish into the warp's embrace. I did not stop them. I had already chosen my path. The helm guided me, or perhaps it hunted me. Every vision pulled me closer to a single point in the galaxy, the cradle of our sin, the world where I had once sworn my oath, Terra. The thought was madness. No traitor had walked its surface in 10,000 years, but madness had long ceased to be my enemy. I gathered what few followers remained, sealed the relic within a stasis field, and turned our ship toward the Astronomican's burning heart. The long war had ended for me the moment I realized I was no longer fighting the Imperium. I was fighting its ghost, and then the ghost lived within me. There is no path through the warp that leads directly to Terra, only the memory of one, a shifting corridor of light and madness that changes each time it's traveled. Our ship, the Requiem of Saints, drifted through that churning sea like a coffin lost in an infinite storm. The Geller field screamed in protest, its lumen wards flickering as tendrils of unreality scraped across the hull. Every deck was haunted by whispers. The Vox grills carried fragments of voices that did not belong to my crew, voices that spoke in the tones of brothers long dead, whispering prayers in a language too old to be remembered. I had begun this journey believing I was returning home. Somewhere along the way I realized I was walking into judgment. The helm, the relic I had found buried beneath that dead world, rested in a containment cradle within my sanctum. I had stopped sleeping. Whenever I closed my eyes, I could see its cracked surface pulsing faintly, as though something inside it breathed. My officers begged me to cast it into the void. Some claimed they could hear it calling them by name when they walked near its chamber. Others swore they saw golden light bleeding through its fractures. But I could not destroy it. I could not even look away. It was the last voice that still spoke in the Emperor's silence. And though I did not understand its words, I could not bear to lose them. Days or centuries. It was impossible to know. Passed within that maelstrom. Time unraveled in loops. There were moments when I stood at the bridge's viewing port and saw stars forming, dying and reforming again in the span of a heartbeat. Once I saw the reflection of my own face in the void glass. Only it wasn't my face. It was younger, unscarred, still bearing the pride of a legionnaire who believed the Emperor's dream could save mankind. He smiled at me, a small, tragic smile before the reflection faded. I remember touching the glass, expecting to feel cold, but the metal was warm. The warp tests all faith, but it feeds most on doubt. I began to wonder whether my journey was penance or temptation. Was I being drawn back to Terra to seek forgiveness or to finish what we had started 10,000 years ago? My crew asked the same in their own quiet way. Fights broke out on the lower decks. Duels fought over meaningless arguments that ended in silence. One by one they came to me, some demanding that we turn back, others begging for the Emperor's mercy. I gave neither. I told them what I had always told myself, that the only truth left to us was forward. When the Astronomican finally appeared, it was not the beacon of divine light I remembered. It was a wound in the fabric of the universe, a sphere of blinding gold streaked with veins of black, pulsing like a heart struggling to keep beating. My helmsman fell to his knees, blood dripping from his eyes, whispering that he could hear the Emperor calling his name. The Vox crackled with bursts of binary, a rhythm I almost recognized. The helm in the sanctum began to hum, its sound vibrating through the ship like a second heartbeat. I gave the order to descend. The warp resisted, clawing at us, twisting the ship into impossible geometry. The deck groaned like a creature in pain. At one point, reality itself split open on the bridge, a crack in space showing a vision of Terra as it had once been, radiant beneath the Emperor's sun. I saw the legions marching in formation, their banners unbroken, their eyes still clear. I saw myself among them. Then the vision shattered, replaced by the darkness of what remained. We emerged above the Sol system in silence. No alarms greeted us, no defense fleets, no challenge codes. The void was empty. Even the Mechanicus forges on Mars were dark, their once eternal glow extinguished. Only the faint pulse of the Astronomican remained, flickering like a dying ember. Terra hung below us, cut and scarred, immense but alive. I could see the curve of its continents, the storm band swirling like the folds of a shroud. My Vox officer whispered that the planet's surface was covered in ruins. No response from any channel. No sign of life. It should have been impossible. The throne world could never be silent. Yet there it was in a dead god's cradle, waiting. I felt the helm's hum rise in pitch until it became almost a voice. I do not remember giving the order to land. Our descent tore through clouds of dust that had once been cities. The palace was still there, its golden spires blackened, its gates collapsed under their own weight. We walked through avenues of statues half swallowed by ash, each bearing the face of warriors I could no longer name. My armor's servos whined softly with each step, echoing through the silence. It felt like trespass. In the shadow of the ruined Eternity Gate, I found a single figure kneeling amid the rubble. At first I thought it a corpse, but then it moved. Slow, deliberate. The armor was ancient, its surface cracked and worn, the color of dried blood. A custodian. His vox grill crackled as he lifted his head, and the sound that emerged was not a greeting but a question. "Why have you come back?" he asked. I did not answer. How could I? I barely knew myself. He looked at me for a long time, then at the helm I carried. His gaze lingered there with something like recognition, or dread. "He still dreams," the custodian said softly, "but he does not wake." And then, as the wind tore through the ruins and the Astronomican flickered above, the last guardian of the throne bowed his head and whispered words that chilled what remained of my soul. "We kept the faith. You brought the fire." The custodian did not rise when I approached. His armor was a reliquary of centuries, its once polished gold dulled to the color of dried marrow. In his stillness, he looked less like a guardian and more like an idea refusing to die. I asked him how long he had waited here, but he did not answer at once. His helm tilted slightly toward the throne's distant silhouette, and in the filtered rasp of his vox I heard the weariness of a god's shadow. "Time here is measured in silence," he said, "and silence has become infinite." He told me that the Emperor's light had faded long ago, that the Astronomican was no longer sustained by faith or sacrifice, but by memory alone, the afterimage of devotion still echoing through the void. "We kept it alive as long as we could," he said, "but every generation prayed a little less, believed a little less, and when belief dies, the light follows." His words struck me harder than any blade ever had. I realized then that our rebellion had not merely shattered a realm, it had hollowed the soul of humanity itself. He looked at me for a long time, and I saw what remained of compassion flicker behind that featureless helm. "You have brought something back," he said, gesturing toward the relic I carried. I placed the helm of the fallen custodian on the ground between us. The cracked surface shimmered faintly, reflecting the dying sunlight. The custodian reached for it with trembling hands. When his gauntlets touched it, the hum returned, deep, resonant, and vast, as though the world itself remembered a language it had forgotten how to speak. The ground shook. Dust cascaded from the broken arches of the gate. The light above the palace flared, brief but blinding, before fading into a deep, rhythmic pulse, one that matched the heartbeat of the relic. The custodian turned his gaze toward me, and in that moment I understood what his silence had been guarding all this time. The Emperor was not gone. He was dreaming of a galaxy that had long since devoured itself. The custodian's voice cracked like old parchment. "He still dreams of unity. He cannot wake. If he wakes, all of this ends." I asked him what this meant, this ruin, this silence, this endless decay. But he only smiled, a small, tired expression that felt older than humanity itself. "Reality," he said. "Faith, us." Then, with the solemn grace of a priest closing the final page of scripture, he lifted the helm, placed it over his own, and bowed his head. The hum deepened, spreading through the ground, the air, the bones of the world. I saw then what no mortal should. The golden walls of the palace shifting like breath, the statues around us trembling as if awakening. For a heartbeat, the entire planet seemed alive again. The air filled with whispers, not in Gothic nor in the languages of the Mechanicus, but in the same impossible tongue I had heard once in dreams. I recognized the rhythm, though not the meaning. A confession recited by a dying god to himself. The custodian spoke once more, his voice breaking beneath the sound. He remembers everything, every oath, every betrayal, and he forgives none of it. Then his body went still. The light within his armor dimmed. The hum receded, leaving only the faint pulse of the Astronomican far above beating in slow, exhausted rhythm. I was alone again, alone in the ruins of mankind's greatest dream. I do not remember how long I stood there, perhaps an hour, perhaps 1,000 years. When I finally turned toward the throne's direction, I realized the path ahead was not stone but bone. The bones of saints and traitors alike, intertwined beyond distinction. Each step I took echoed like a heartbeat, as if the world itself were listening. I carried the custodian's helm under my arm. It was cold now, inert, but I swore I could still feel its weight shifting with each breath, as if waiting for me to understand something I had not yet earned. At the base of the ruined palace gates, I stopped. Through the cracks in the stone, faint light spilled. Not gold, not holy, but pale and uncertain. It pulsed once, and I felt warmth against my chest where my own armor had split long ago. The light called to me. I knew then that this was the end of my pilgrimage, the last step of a circle that began beneath the sun of Terra and now returned beneath its ashes. I whispered into the silence. If you still dream, my lord, then let me be your nightmare. Let me remember for you what you cannot bear. And in answer, the light flickered, just once, like a dying flame that refuses to go out. That was enough. There are no doors to the throne. There never were. Only the illusion of passage, a corridor of broken faith stretching endlessly inward. The gate was a wound in the world, carved by worship and time, its archway blackened with the soot of 1 billion burnt offerings. I walked alone, though I could feel the weight of every life that had ever knelt here pressing down upon me. The air was thick with incense and decay, the scent of sanctified oil clinging to rusted icons and shattered aquila. Each step echoed like the tolling of a funeral bell. As I crossed into the sanctum, the darkness began to breathe. Not sound, but vibration, low, rhythmic, vast. It was the same pulse I had heard in the helm, the same that had shaken the ground when the custodian spoke his final words. It seemed to come from the very bones of Terra, from the marrow of the planet itself. My armor's sensors flickered and died. The light of my helm dimmed. I removed it, and there he was. Not as I had seen him in frescoes or remembered him in the banners of the Great Crusade. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne, a structure of unimaginable complexity, equal parts tomb and engine, god and machine. Cables thick as serpents coiled around his withered frame, vanishing into the darkness above. The machinery pulsed with slow, uneven rhythm, each motion a labor, each flicker of light a breath forced through dying lungs. His body was still, unmummified, ossified, but his eyes burned, not bright but deep like coals buried beneath ash. I fell to my knees, not from reverence but from the weight of it, the realization that I was standing in the presence of the thing I had both betrayed and worshipped for 10,000 years. My mind could not hold it. No mind could. I tried to speak, but the words dissolved in my throat. There was no language left for what I needed to say. Then, impossibly, I heard him, not as a voice, but as a thought pressed directly into the core of my being. It was vast and intimate all at once, a tide that filled every empty space within me. It did not ask. It did not command. It remembered. And in that remembrance I saw everything. The day I took my oath beneath the golden sun, the moment my blade turned on a brother's throat, the centuries of wandering, the prayers spoken to a silent void. I saw myself from every angle, from every life that my sin had touched. I saw the Legion burn. I saw the Primarch weeping as he knelt before his father's throne, his pride finally broken. I saw the Emperor not as god or corpse, but as man, exhausted, betrayed, infinite in his sorrow. And then the memory shifted. I saw the Imperium now, a decaying empire bound together not by love or hope, but by fear and bureaucracy, by prayers shouted at an empty throne. Billions lived and died every day in his name, and still he sat unmoving, silent, dreaming. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to blame him for all that had been lost. But as I stood there beneath the flickering glow of his dying light, I realized the truth that had haunted me since Istvan. We were all the same. He was our reflection, our ambition given shape. We had built him as much as he had built us. The air crackled. The ground shook. The cables feeding into the throne tightened, groaning under strain. The Emperor's head lifted fractionally, and the light behind his eyes flared. The sound that followed was not a voice, not even a word. It was a wave of memory, a tide of meaning that shattered what remained of my mind. You never left me. I fell forward, my forehead striking the metal floor. Blood smeared against gold. My lungs seized as the air filled with the ozone tang of raw psychic energy. I wanted to beg forgiveness, but no prayer would come. My throat burned with the taste of iron and tears. He showed me then what eternity meant. Not peace, not glory, a cycle. The endless recurrence of rebellion and faith, of creation and ruin. Every age of mankind had been born from the ashes of the one before, and every god we built was destined to fall beneath the weight of its own worshippers. The Emperor was no exception. He bore that burden willingly, eternally, not out of cruelty, but out of love. The light dimmed. The chamber grew still. I could no longer tell whether he had spoken or whether I had dreamed it. My vision blurred, and for a moment I saw him not as he was now, but as he had been, radiant, human, smiling as he placed a hand upon my shoulder and said the words I had waited 10 millennia to hear. You are forgiven. The moment vanished. The throne was silent once more. Forgiveness should have felt like light. I thought it would tear the weight from my shoulders, strip the centuries of sin away until only something clean remained. But as the words, or the illusion of them, faded, I understood that what the Emperor offered was not absolution. It was recognition. He had seen me. For the first time since I turned my blade upon his dream, he had looked at me without anger or judgment, and that simple act was enough to unmake me. The chamber was utterly still. The light that poured from the throne had softened, the terrible glare reduced to a glow that trembled at the edge of darkness. My breathing rasped in my ears. I reached toward him, not to touch, not to worship, but to know. The air between us shimmered. My hand stopped inches away from his ruined knee plate, and what I felt was not heat or cold but weight. The weight of an entire species pressed into one point of gravity. Images burst behind my eyes, fragments of thought that did not belong to me. The birth of the Imperium, worlds rising and falling in endless procession, the screams of psychers dying to feed the beacon above Terra. I saw the faces of 1,000 saints and murderers, each convinced that their suffering would earn his notice. I saw the Adeptus Custodes standing vigil through millennia, their golden armor fading, their faith hardened into habit. I saw the Mechanicus tending the throne's machinery as though it were a god in its own right, whispering binary prayers to a mind too vast to answer. I saw the warp pulsing beyond the walls, a sea of ghosts nourished by the echoes of human belief. And within all of it, one truth threaded through like a blade. He was alone. The Emperor's power filled everything, but his mind was bound in isolation deeper than death. The throne was not prison or monument. It was a promise kept too long. To keep the Astronomican burning, he had given himself to the machinery of divinity, and the machinery had never stopped hungering. Every prayer, every ritual, every act of faith was a link in a chain that kept him bound. I felt his endurance, a will that refused to die because the species he loved refused to stop demanding it. I dropped my hand. The sound of my gauntlet striking the floor echoed like thunder. Something inside the throne answered, a low mechanical growl that could have been pain or agreement. My vision blurred again, and when it cleared I realized I was kneeling before the remains of a man, not a god. The grandeur stripped away, I saw what had always been there, a body sustained by horror, a dream sustained by necessity. I spoke then, my voice shaking against the silence. What would you have me do? No answer. Only the hum of the machines and the slow, steady rhythm of a dying star. I felt foolish. The question had been my curse from the beginning. Always asking for orders, always mistaking obedience for faith. I lowered my head and whispered to the floor, then I will choose for both of us. From the folds of my armor I took the custodian's cracked helm. Its weight seemed to grow heavier as I lifted it toward the throne. The fractures along its surface flared briefly, threads of red and gold intertwining like veins of living metal. I placed it at his feet. The light within the throne pulsed once, twice, then steadied. For the first time I felt warmth on my skin. I do not know if what happened next was real. Perhaps it was only the last kindness of a dying god granting meaning to a traitor's delusion. But as I turned to leave, the shadows moved. The golden surface of the throne seemed to ripple, and the whisper of 1,000 voices merged into one. They did not speak words. They simply breathed. The entire palace exhaled, and the dust on the floor stirred like living ash. Outside, through the shattered walls, I saw the horizon bloom with light. The Astronomican, that failing beacon, burned bright once more, not with the steady brilliance of old, but with a living, flickering warmth, as if the universe itself remembered what dawn felt like. I fell to my knees again, but this time not in worship. It was relief, the kind that breaks instead of heals. When the light faded, I stood alone. The custodian's helm had vanished. The Emperor sat unmoving, his glow diminished to embers. The silence that followed was total, but it was not empty. It was peace. I left the throne the way I had entered, through the corridors of ruin and memory, beneath statues that now seemed to watch me with something like compassion. As I stepped beyond the Eternity Gate, I looked once more at the sky above Terra. The ashes that hung in the atmosphere caught the last fragments of light and shimmered like stars. I thought of my brothers, of the war that had stretched across time itself, and I understood that the long war was over. Not because we had won, nor because we had surrendered, but because there was nothing left to fight. The galaxy would continue as it always had, imperfect, defiant, alive. The Emperor would dream, and in his dream, perhaps we would all find a place to rest. I turned my gaze eastward, toward the horizon, where the sun tried to rise through clouds of gold and ash. My armor was cracked, my body failing, but I felt lighter than I had in 10,000 years. As I began my walk back through the ruins, I whispered to no one, to everyone. We are his sons still. Even in ruin we remember. The wind answered in its own way, carrying the sound of shifting dust like the soft applause of a dying world. And then, for the first time since Istvan, there was silence, true and merciful.